Live on Facebook, it says.
Oh, we're live?
That's what
Are we
the
still
phone
live?
says.
Are we still live?
You know, there's that delay on there, so it takes a minute before
I know.
we see it. So hopefully we're live.
I hope we're live. Please tell me that we're live. Hi, everybody. Sharon and Annie here, week 5 with the By Annie Inspired By series. Still learning, still trying to come up a new way. And we were a little delayed here. Okay, it says I'm on. So they're telling me that we're back. So
All right.
we were live,
Yay.
and then we weren't live, and now we're live again. So welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, Annie. We're happy to have you this week. And, it's like bittersweet. It's, the 5th week, and we've enjoyed having you so much. So I'd like to get started so that we can get into this week's program, because Annie has a lot to cover in terms of bias bindings on bags. And I think we'd like to start first by announcing last week's winners, if that's okay with you, Annie.
That sounds like a fabulous idea. She's going to announce the winners.
Right. So last week we had a take a stand. Is the pattern. And Annie is providing all of the components necessary, the pattern, the strapping, the hardware to make that bag. And the take a stand winner is Cindy GYGAX. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. And Cindy, you are winning this beautiful fabric from Spirit in the Garden by Kelly Mae Krenz. She's a new designer for Free Spirit, and this collection is shipping in June. And hold on, I was just told we're on double screen. Okay. And so this collection is shipping in June, and we will ship that off to Cindy. And then we have the Bowl Me Over pattern right here. And Annie is shipping all of this. We're shipping all of this together to the winner, Beth McMahon. And this is Snow Leopard, and this fabric is shipping in May. So all of this fabric, which is gorgeous, you get the koi fish and the water and the scales. All the fabrics are beautiful. They're too hard to pick. And the last one is an Instagram winner. It's the Catch-All Caddy. Here's the Catch-All Caddy. And we've got these Tim Holtz beautiful fabrics from his memoranda collection. And the winner of this is Steph Lock 5. So any of those winners, Cindy Gygax, Beth McMahon, or Steph Lock 5, if you could contact us and let us know your shipping address, congratulations. And thank you to Annie for supplying the patterns and accessories for those bags. We appreciate it, and we know our winners will as well. So I would like to turn this over to Annie, because I know that that's why we're all tuned in here, as we want to see what Annie has to show us this week with the bindings. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Annie.
Thanks so much, Sharon. I'm so excited to be here. I'm really kind of sad that it's the last week, because this has been so much fun being with you every week for the past 5 weeks, but we'll make sure we meet again. Today, yes, we're going to cover one of those topics that I think causes people the most concern, and that's bindings. And I'm going to share some really great techniques for you, how to make your own custom bindings, and also tips for accomplishing smooth, wrinkle-free bindings on any project. My focus today is going to be on purses and bags, but keep in mind that these techniques will work for other projects too. So if you're making placemats, wall hangings, quilts, the binding techniques are going to be the same. As you can see, bindings can add really beautiful, eye-catching accents and a professional finish to your project. This striped binding on this Take a Stand bag really livens, my mouth is falling over itself, really livens it up and just takes it up to a whole nother level. One of the real hallmarks of a By Annie bag is that there aren't any raw edges anywhere. So even on the inside, where you've got the edges, we always make sure that we cover everything with a binding. So even on our smallest bags, all of the edges are finished, and that's something that people really like. The other thing that bindings do is they really give good structure and stability to your project. So you can see the edges on this Take a Stand bag where we found it, not Take a Stand, this In Control bag. I've had too many late nights lately, so if I get my words mixed up today, you're going to know why. But by binding these edges, it really gives it some structure and helps it stand up really well. And you'll see the same thing on this, which is our undercover, which is our sewing machine cover. By putting that binding on the edge, this cover is going to stand up all by itself, even when there's not a machine underneath it. So bindings not only add a pretty accent to it, but they give it structure and make it stand up. On this particular one, I can't tell you how often I've had people say, what kind of cording did you put in the edges of that? And there's no cording in here. This is just binding that's covering the edges of the seams and going all the way around here. So it's 2 layers of quilted fabric with soft and stable between them, and then a binding. So the soft and stable gives the structure and look of a corded binding, but without any of those extra steps. Just as we make handles and straps to match our projects, we also want to be able to make bindings that perfectly coordinate with the rest of the project. So all by Annie patterns are going to include complete instructions for making and attaching custom bindings. And there are many, many benefits to making your own custom binding. First of all, it's going to match your project perfectly. Second, you can choose the best style. So you can make a straight grain binding if you're doing straight edges, a cross grain binding, or a bias binding. You can also do a single fold or a double fold, and you can cut it to the perfect width. A lot of times I've had people write me and say, can't I just do a commercial binding? And if you look at this, you're going to see that it's a totally different animal. First of all, no matter what width you get, it's not going to be the same perfect width as what we do. And their method of making a double fold binding is to just turn the edges over, and then you put that on your project and sew along the edge. But that's going to give you a really wide binding, and it's going to be harder to finish the edges. So the way we do bindings is we cut a width depending on the project we're doing, but we fold that binding in half and then fold it in half and attach it to the project. And then we fold it in half again so that we've got a double fold binding. The beauty of that is all of our raw edges are hidden and only the folded edges are exposed. This type of binding is really quick and easy to apply, and it also prolongs the wear because, as you can see out here where the edge is, we've got a double layer of fabric. If you've cut your fabric on the bias, you'll get even longer wear because there's going to be way more threads along those exposed edges. Depending on how many layers we're binding, we're going to cut the binding to a various widths. 2 inches is perfect for a single layer of vinyl, mesh, or quilted fabric. So if you look at the flap on this little bag, we're only binding a single layer of quilted fabric. So we trim this binding to 2 inches before we attach it. If we're binding the edges on the bag, as we did here, where we've got 2 layers sewn together, we're going to bind that with a 2 1/4 inch binding. That's our choice pretty much all the time, is the 2 1/4 inch binding. Very, very occasionally, we will suggest a wider binding, like a 2 1/2 inch binding, especially if there's a whole lot of layers or it's a big one. So I think really the only pattern I can think of off the top of my head that calls for that is our travel duffel. Usually the 2 1/4 is my binding of choice. And here's a really important tip to know about it. The tighter your binding is, the better it's going to look. It's going to be much easier to accomplish a smooth, wrinkle-free binding if it's completely filled. And we'll talk about that more soon when I show you some demos. Making your own custom binding also allows you to cut the binding on the grain of your choice. So let me grab somewhere in here. I should have a square of fabric to show you how to do bias bindings. Sharon, greet people for a minute while I look for that, because I'm not sure what happened to that piece of fabric.
Okay, no problem. Hi, everybody. Just Annie's looking for her fabric, so I'm going to talk to you, welcome you all to this week's episode of Bindings with By Annie. And I see that there are some people here. What I learned this week is that Australia is 12 hours, well, I knew that before, but became vividly aware that they're 12 hours behind us. And we have people that are watching now. So 3:15 p.m. here, Eastern Standard Time makes it, I think, 3 in the morning there. So we have people watching from 3 in the morning. So we have people from Canada, we have people from all over our country. Portland, I'm going to assume Portland, Oregon, maybe, Pittsburgh. We got people tuning in from everywhere, so thank you. We're doing bias bindings this week with Annie, and she's going to be showing us some tips and tricks for that. And I know some people are very excited to learn this, and I know that once you master the bindings, it's always a much easier process for any bag or quilt or any other project you might be applying a binding to. And let me see. I'm looking for some notes in here. Hello from Central Maine. Annie, a couple of people are asking some questions about the needles and breaking needles when they're doing binding. So hopefully we can maybe talk about that as well when you come back on. But please send us notes. Let us know, because let us know where you're tuning in from. We love to know where you're tuning in from. Let us know what you're enjoying about this series, because we like to know that as well, both Free Spirit and Annie. I know many of the viewers are new to Free Spirit, so please come to our website and check us out. We're at Free Spirit Fabrics with an S, freespiritfabrics.com. And you can check out all of our beautiful fabrics. We have many, many beautiful designers. We have great designs and color and a lot of fun. And all these bags that you're seeing every week that Annie's been showing are all made for Free Spirit Fabrics. So let us know your favorite designers or anything new that you see, or any of Annie's bags that are your favorites. I mean, we love to hear from you on all the things you're learning and what you're enjoying most about the Inspired By series. And I'm not sure, are you ready, Annie?
Well, I cannot find my demonstration for bias binding. So Glow's going to go cut a piece of fabric, and we'll come back to that in a minute. We'll just keep talking. So,
okay, sounds great.
What I was going to talk about next was the ability to cut the binding on the grain of your choice. So for instance, if you can cut a cross grain binding going across your fabric from selvage to selvage, or you can cut a lengthwise grain, which is called a straight grain binding. A straight grain binding is especially helpful when you're making quilts, because you can sew it and it has very little stretch along the straight grain. So if you look at this piece of fabric, it's not what I want it to show you, but you can see there's very little stretch going on the up and down grain. So that's helpful for quilts. We rarely use that in our patterns because it doesn't use the fabric as efficiently. So most of the time we cut our fabric on the crosswise grain. And that we use if we're doing things that are just straight edges. But anytime that you have something that's a curved edge, you need to cut on a bias grain. So this one was cut on a bias, and you can see there's a whole lot more stretch here to this. So we'll talk about that more later, but the ability to cut that how you want works really good. Let me show you some tricks for doing a bias binding. Had I had my samples here, I would have had pieces all ready to go, but we're just going to work through this together. So when you're ready to cut a bias binding, we start with a square of fabric. And so we're going to cut this in half diagonally to make 2 triangles. And so I'm going to, let me show you a tip, because I don't have a ruler here big enough to fit diagonally from corner to corner on this. So what I'm going to do is fold this in half. And this is really helpful. A lot of my patterns will tell you to cut maybe a 22-inch square, and you're not going to have a ruler long enough to go there. So I'm going to line my ruler up on here. I'm going to bring it over. Can you notice how I've got my line lined up right here? So it's straight. And I also have a straight line going here. And I'm going to cut that. And that's going to give me two triangles of fabric. All right, now here's a good trick. We really love using Tula Pink stripes for our bindings. And when you use a stripe, it gives you just this awesome kind of candy stripe appearance going around here. I really take pride in doing bindings so that people cannot tell where I joined the edges. So if I took these two squares, what we're going to do is join these two triangles on this long diagonal edge here. And so if I joined these like this, it would be really easy to match those up. I could just, you know, sew that, so I was sewing down the middle of my purple stripes, and that would make it, you know, really unnoticeable. But when I go to cut my strips and join these ends, they're not going to match. So when I'm working with Tula stripes or anyone's stripes, this is what I do. I do the hard part first. So I'm going to take these two pieces and I'm going to match them up so that my stripes are matched. And then I take this one and fold it over. Let me describe this too. So when I join the strips, I'm going to position one so that I have a mountain. So you can see here my peak is at the top. I'm going to position the other one as a valley. So my peak is at the bottom. And then I'm going to put those together, and that's where I'm going to sew those. I'm going to take my valley, I'm going to fold it over onto my mountain, and then I'm going to align these. Now, if I joined that like that, you can see that when I opened that, none of my stripes would be matching, and all those seams would be really noticeable. So I'm going to just scoot these over, and I always give you enough extra binding that if you're going to be able to square these up, I will probably align those there. And I'm going to put a pin on every single one of those stripes and then sew that together with a 1/4 inch seam. This is probably not going to come out as perfect. Normally I would pin these like that so I can sew that with a 1/4 inch seam, but because I can't find my step outs, we're going to have to improvise here. So we're going to sew, pretend that these pins are stitching. We're going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to press that seam open, and when you open it out, you're going to see that your stripes all flow beautifully. Now, from this parallelogram, you're going to cut your pieces for your bindings. And obviously, we're not going to be able to do this because this isn't sewn, but we're going to cut across here. This is one really important thing. I've seen too many times in classes where people rotated it like this and started cutting their strips out of it. All you end up with then is straight grain binding with a ton of seams in it. So make sure that you're cutting on the bias edge when you cut these. And what I will often do is just go like this, especially when I first started and this was all new to me. I would double check and make sure that I was cutting on that bias edge. Here's another little trick. Obviously, my ruler's not going to be big enough, and most times I've got a bigger triangle than this, and my ruler's not big enough to go from side to side. Rather than having to move my ruler along here, once I have this seam pressed open, I take this side and fold it over and line it up along that seam. I take this side and fold it over. Actually, I usually do it with the right sides out. So let's pretend that seam is sewn. I'm going to line this up, and what's important is that I get this really nice and even here. And that means that's going to go right along that seam. Then I fold this one over really nice and even. And then I can lay my ruler on here and start cutting my strips. Again, usually I'm cutting 2 1/4 inch. And so I need to find the 2 1/4 inch line on my ruler. I'll usually square that up a little bit if it's uneven, but then I start cutting and I cut my strips. then I take those strips, and let's just pretend we can do it here. So I take those strips and join them. So let's just cut this so that we've got two diagonals. Oh, I cut it the wrong way. Oh, here. So we'll join here. Normally, I would not join that end. I would trim that off and just discard that. But we're going to join these. And when I started, I had a hard time figuring out how to align these. I determined that if I would lay it on my table just like this is how I want it to look when it's done. And then I just take this one and fold it over so that my right sides are together. I could align my pieces on there. Let's go down here. Let's try this end where we don't have that seam in there. So I'm going to align these on here, and then I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam and press that seam open. Now, again, when I first started, I found that difficult knowing exactly where to do that, so that once I had that seam pressed, it laid out and was nice and straight. Here's a secret to that. If you're new to this and that is difficult for you, mark yourself a 1/4 inch seam allowance on here. So just mark a seam allowance on your top strip, and then you can position it so that the point of that is right where that little angle is, and the point right there is right where that angle is. And then you can stitch across this, and when you open it up, it's going to look like this. You're going to have a beautiful finish on that. So that's in a nutshell how you can make your own bindings. Just remember, straight grain or cross grain bindings are going to be the ones that we use when we're doing straight edges. Bias bindings are what we're going to use anytime we have curved edges or rounded corners. And all by Annie patterns will include complete instructions for cutting and attaching them, plus labels to attach to the pieces so you're sure to grab the right piece when it's time to bind an edge. That's a basic overview of types of binding. Before we start talking about how to attach bindings, do you have any questions, Sharon?
Well, I have a question. I mean, the viewers may have a question, but I have one watching you do that. So I heard you say that there's straight grain binding, and then you've got your bindings cut on the bias. For your bags, if I wanted to make all of my binding cut on the bias and only the bias, could I do that? Or do you recommend not doing that for some reason while we're making the bag?
No, you absolutely could do that. Just usually when we're doing, for instance, the bindings on here, which actually I'm going to show you how to do next, we cut these at 2 inches because 2 1/4 would be too wide. When we do these bindings, we need 2 1/4 to be able to go over the depth. So you just have to make sure that you're cutting them the right width. And if you're starting with the square, because we calculate the size of a square so that you know how big of a piece you need, you'd have to make a bigger square. And here's the math on how I do that. Let's say that you're going to bind, let's just bring this out. So let's say you're going to bind this Peacekeeper bag, and this is, say, 12 inches, and this is 10 inches. So you have 12 inches plus 10 inches is 22 inches, and then you have that same for these sides. So you need 44 linear inches of binding to go around this. What you're going to do is take that 44 inches, multiply it by the width that you're cutting the binding. In this case, we're cutting 2 1/4. So 44 times 2 1/4 is, say, 100 inches. That's not what it is, but let's say that's what it is to make it easy. Once you get that number, you find the square root of that. A square root of 100 is 10 inches. So you know that if you start with a 10-inch square of binding, you should have 100 inches, linear inches of binding when you're done. Now, that I always look at my ruler and make sure I can get complete strips out of it. So usually I end up making it a little bit bigger. And I can tell you, if you cut a 10-inch square, you're going to have a whole lot of seams in it. So usually we don't do anything much smaller than maybe a 15-inch square. But it's amazing how you can take a 15-inch square and a 16.5-inch square and get oodles more binding. So it really grows exponentially the length that you need. So, you know, if the pattern tells you to cut a 15-inch square and you think, oh, I need twice that much, you don't want to cut a 30-inch square, or you will have 4 times more binding than what you had with the 15-inch, because you've got that 4 times. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I love how you just showed us how to do the stripes, match up the stripes, and how to cut those bindings. The only reason I asked about the bias cut versus the straight edge is I understand, you know, in order to get around the curves, you need the bias cut. It's just going to be a smoother process overall, but I just didn't know if there was a disadvantage to not making your binding all of that, you know, in that one technique. A lot of the viewers are asking about the videos. All of these videos that Annie has done for us in this Inspired By series are up on YouTube, and they're on our Facebook page, and they're on Instagram. So if you want to go back and look at any of them and rewatch them or slow them down as you're sewing and, you know, pause them and then go back to them, they're all here. So all 5 weeks will be here. You can go back and view them. And if you are purchasing any patterns, either through your local retailer, or if you go to byannie.com and purchase the patterns, Annie also has videos that are available with her patterns. So, you know, she tries to make it as easy as possible for you to always be able to access the information you need and make the whole process a lot more seamless for you. So please keep that in mind, because I see a lot of people making posts about that. Everybody is very excited to be here. We still have people from all over tuning in. So thank you everybody for tuning in. We're so happy to have everyone back, and we're glad that people are asking questions. Annie, there was a question earlier where somebody had asked about they break needles a lot when they're sewing their bindings on. So I don't know if that's a topic at some point along. Okay.
I am going to talk about that later, because I have a good tip for that.
Oh yeah, I'd like that tip too. I do that a lot too. So let me see.
If we get to the end and I haven't covered it, remind me, but
okay.
Actually, I can talk about it really briefly right now. One of the things that I discovered about breaking needles is that what's happening is I am trying to do the work that the machine's doing. So I'm either pulling on the fabric or I'm pushing the fabric. And when you're binding something and you're trying to control everything and keep it going, that happens. But what happens when you pull on the fabric or push on it, your needle is getting bent as it goes down, and then it hits something down there, and that's what causes it to break. I learned this when I was making one of these ruler wraps, and we were getting ready to film a video for it. And we had, for some reason, the lighting wasn't right. And so we had moved, I had 2 sewing tables in my room, and we had moved one of them over into a different part of the room to do the filming on. And I needed to get some things ready for the next day's filming. And so I had this great big piece of quilted fabric, and I was trying to sew bindings on it. And I swear I broke 4 needles, just one right after the other, as I was working on that. And I finally realized that what was happening is that as I was sewing along, this ruler wrap was falling off of the back of the table and pulling on my fabric as I went and causing the needle to break. I finally went and got my ironing board and another table and put them on the other side so that that big piece of fabric, you know, had something to support it and it wasn't pulling down, and I didn't break another needle. I rarely break needles. And once I discovered that, it just solved all the problems. And it's not going through a lot of layers that causes your needle to break, it's it bending. If you are going through a lot of layers, the best thing I can tell you is slow down. You know, don't go too fast, take your time, and just, you know, let the machine pull it through, don't pull or push it.
Oh, that's a great tip. So let the machine do the work, just guide,
Yep.
right? And moral of the story, and then if you just distribute the weight evenly, it should help prevent that as well.
Yes. And
Very
so
good
the
tip.
other thing that's really helpful is if you can sew with your machine in a cabinet so that your project is resting, you know, when it comes out. What often happens too is people are in a classroom and they've got their machine up on a table and they have that little table next to it. and again, their project is falling off on one side or the other, and that's pulling it and making the needle bend. So, you know, if you have to sew that way, put some books or something on the other side so that your whole piece is supported.
Great, great tips. Thank you for that. Now, we're going to move on in another piece of this. Well, wait a minute, before we do, I wanted to let everybody know that we have Nancy Jewell, who is answering questions for Free Spirit on behalf of Free Spirit. And Annie has people from her team also answering questions. So if you have questions as we go, I'll try to pay attention. Somebody, let me see, DC, I find using Annie's stiletto helps me not push and pull so much. So great comment on that. I'm sure Annie's going to talk to us about that coming up. But keep on sending the questions. We'll try and answer you as best we can. And again, keep in mind that all these videos are available to you in the future. So you can rewatch, and if you missed any of them, you can tune in and watch them again. And we would love for you to do that. Okay, Annie, back to you.
All right. We've talked about how to cut your bindings and whether to use cross grain or bias. Next, let's talk about attaching bindings. Attaching bindings really is easy if you know a few basic principles and if you have the right tools. There are two really important tools that in my mind are essential for accomplishing beautiful bindings. First, a sewing machine that has the needle down feature and a good 1/4 inch foot. I sew on a Bernina, and this is the foot that I use most of the time. This is the Bernina 1/4 inch foot. It's a number 37 foot. I can tell you I buy sewing machines for this foot because being able to sew an accurate 1/4 inch seam is really, really important for bindings. And having that needle down feature engaged so that you can always stop with the needle down and readjust your fabric without it moving is really essential. Equally important to the machine and a 1/4 inch foot is an extra special tool that we designed. If you've ever watched any of my videos, you've noticed that I have this special tool in my hand, whoops, unless I drop it, all the time. So this is called a By Annie stiletto and pressing tool, and we spent probably 2 years working on this. It's just an essential part of my toolbox, and especially when I'm attaching bindings. I really don't think I could sew without this tool. So here's what makes this tool really special. First of all, it's really lightweight, so your hand doesn't get tired. We turned it so that it's got little things which make it easy to hold, things that grip your hand, you can grip on it. There's a pressing tool on the end so that if you need to press a seam, it's cut at just the right angle to make pressing a seam really easy. We flattened the side so when you drop it, it stays put and it's not rolling on the floor. But more than anything, the thing that sets this stiletto apart from every other stiletto on the market is this tip. It's just the right length, it's nice and sharp, but we send these to a needle making factory and they sand grind them for us. So it's just a little bit rough. It's not so rough that it's going to snag your fabric, but it's rough enough that it stays where you put it and it's not continually sliding off and making you tired. So it really is the secret for doing bindings. If you don't have one of these, get one. If you have one of them, you probably want at least 2 or 3 more, because as I said, I always have this in my hand. And so pretty soon I've got one at the cutting table, one at the ironing board, one at my computer, and I have to go gather them all back. And I just put them in my pin cushion. I have these wool pin cushions that we make. I stick them in there. So I usually start the day with about 6 in there. And when they're all gone, I go gather them up and start fresh. So keep this in mind. All right, let's talk now about the basic steps for attaching the bindings. And the first thing that is really important, and I learned this in the very first class that I ever taught, I was complaining about how sometimes when I would fold my bindings over and stitch them down, I would get wrinkles and creases in it. And one of the ladies in the class said, well, how did you prepare the binding? Did you press it? And I said, oh yes, I was really careful to press it. And she said, that's your problem. Don't press it. She said, if you just take that binding in half and fold it and pin it, you're going to eliminate that problem. And I have never pressed a binding since then. It is amazing the difference that it made. So I recommend that when you do this, you leave it laying flat on your table. Don't try to do it up in the air, because then it's easy to not get those edges either. Lay it down on your table, fold it so your edges are aligned, and then just put a pin in every 2 to 3 inches to hold those layers together. So then it's going to look like this. Again, just having it pinned and not having a sharp crease in there makes it lay a lot better. Then we're ready to attach it to the edge. And what I'm working on here is these little strips that go on my Bowl Me Over bag. So I'm making one out of this fun Kismet fabric. So after you have that pinned, then you're just going to align it. We're binding both edges. So we're aligning it along the raw edges of our piece. And you can put some Wonder Clips on there to hold that in place if you want. But I have to admit, I usually don't. I just start sewing. But you're going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to take this off so you can see where I've done that here. So I've sewn all the way across with a nice 1/4 inch seam. And then my next step is to turn this over to the other side and stitch it down. And we're just going to hide all those raw edges in there and stitch right along that folded edge. So you can see right here is our previous line of stitching where we attached it. When we fold this over, we want our folded edge to go just past that, so that when we stitch close to that folded edge, it falls out in about the same place on the other side. So this side is going to be hidden. I don't usually worry as much about this, but you can see pretty well I've got my stitching right in the same place all the way until I get almost to this end. So that I call success. We'll bind all those edges of that, and then they'll be ready to attach to the back. Now let's talk about what you do if you're going to do a binding on a curved edge. So we've got this Peacekeeper that we've started, and one of the things that we like to do is, rather than trying to do mitered corners, which you'd have to do if these were square, we like to round the corners. And so we get our circle rulers and we just align them on each corner. I think we talked about that a little bit last time. If you want to say round a corner here, you're going to align your ruler so that it's even here and here, and then you can just cut using your rotary cutter to trim that away. So that's what I've done on all 4 corners of this. Now I'm ready to bind these edges. Everything else is finished on this. One of the important things to consider is, where do you start? I like to do all of my binding by machine. So I want it to look the best on the front, so I want to do that as my last stitching. So I always start on the back. I also like to join my ends with a diagonal seam. So I want to do that where I have the most room. On this project, I've got more room for joining my ends than I do here. So I'm going to join my ends here. So I usually take a little tail and I leave it about in the middle of the project. And then I start sewing close to the edge. I want to have, some of this unstitched. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to bring it all the way around here, and I'm going to stop when I get about right here so that I can join the ends here. As you start stitching, the secret on this is to keep the edges of the binding really even with the edges of the bag, and stitch with a nice 1/4 inch seam. You'll notice that I do not pin or clip this binding to the project, because I discovered that I give it a tiny bit of a stretch as I go. So I just have this loose and I start stitching. As I get to these corners, I'm going to use my fingers here. This is much easier when it's in front of me at the sewing machine. But I'm going to, let's see if I can do this. I have to have my stiletto. So I take my stiletto and I use it to kind of hold this in place against this. And then I use this finger to smooth it out and make sure that I'm not sewing any wrinkles in it. So if you look here, you can see how nice and flat that lays, and that I'm not sewing any creases in that binding as I go around the edges. So you'll keep going until you get all the way to the edge, and then you'll join it. This is a free pattern on our website, and we have a great video that shows you how I like to join the ends. and that's a really important one to watch. So I'm not going to take time to do that today, but make sure you watch the video for that. I've got one here where I've got those ends already attached, and this has the binding attached all the way around. And one thing that I wanted to mention, as you're sewing your binding in place, you're trying to keep the edges of the binding even with the edges of the bag. You're trying to make sure that your foot is always staying parallel to the edge. So you don't want your foot going off this way or going this way. You want it running right parallel to the edge. And you're trying to sew an accurate 1/4 inch seam. It's a lot to pay attention to. And I have found, sometimes I just can't keep it all going. So what I don't worry about as much is the accurate 1/4 inch seam, because I can always go back and refine it later. So sometimes I want to make sure I'm not going more than a 1/4 inch, but I can go less. And so on here, I've kind of shown you what I've done here. So after I have this sewn in place, then my next step is to turn it around to the front and stitch it down. And I have a couple places here where I purposely sewed less than a 1/4 inch so you can see what happens. So if you look right here, as I bring this binding around, notice how when I fold this over, if I stitch right along this folded edge, that line of stitching is going to end up way out here. It's not going to be right on top of the stitching like I want it. So if I take the folded edge and align it just past that line of stitching so that my stitching falls out, then I've got all this loose binding out here. That's going to look wrinkly. That's going to look ugly. So that's why it's really important that you do a really accurate 1/4 inch seam. If you're finding that your binding doesn't go far enough to cover the edge, usually I don't go wider, so I don't know if I showed that on here anywhere. But if, for instance, your binding ends up like right there and it's just not going to pull far enough over, you've got a couple options. You can either unstitch it, which is what I would do on a long straight edge like this. If it's a corner, which is where I occasionally have that happen, I'll usually just trim a little fabric away from my corner so that I can pull it around. But know too that your stiletto, again, has that rough edge. I can take this and I can grab this. I mean, I could pull it way over there if I want it, but I can usually really pull that tight and help it hold. So as I'm going around, I just take this, position it where I want it. So I want it just past that line of stitching. I put my needle down and I start stitching. Stitch to there, and I just work an inch at a time. I can use the tip of the stiletto to push any of those threads that are loose under there. And again, I just work my way all the way around the project. Notice here, can you see this little bit of wrinkle here? If I had pressed that binding and I had that wrinkle, it would be really hard to get rid of it. But since I haven't pressed it, I can just take my fingers on here and kind of massage that piece of fabric, and all those wrinkles disappear. And you can see I'm going to have a really beautiful binding there. So stitch those. I mean, before I do this, I test it. Usually I find that somewhere it's not wide enough. So usually what I do is I just go around a second time. You can see up here where I've got a line of stitching where I attached my zipper to the project. I'm not sure what that other line is, but here's where I came back and did my really accurate 1/4 inch seam to make sure it did it. Because Soft and Stable compresses every time you sew through it, I never worry about it if I'm doing some extra lines of stitching in there, because it's just going to make it lay really nice. So when I'm done, I'm going to have a beautiful bag that looks like this. All right, so that's doing bindings on fabric. We also like to use vinyl for our bindings, and here's a couple tricks for that. I'm not actually going to sew one, but I'm going to show you what it looks like. So on this pocket, we used vinyl for the pocket and we bound the edge. You're going to do it exactly the way we did the bindings on the other. The secret is you don't want to put pins in your vinyl because it's going to leave holes. So make sure if you have to attach something to it, you use Wonder Clips. And you're also going to find that depending on your sewing machine, if you've got any plastic on the bed, as soon as your piece of vinyl hits it, it's not going to want to move. So when you buy the vinyl, you get a little piece of tissue paper with it. You can either keep that underneath because then it's going to slide really easily, or you can cover the thing up. On my Bernina, there's a little window right in front of where the needle plate is so that you can see the bobbin case. I usually just take painter's tape and put that on there, and then that helps my vinyl slide really easily. I use the same 9014 top stitch needle. I use the same thread. I use the same stitch length, bind it just like I did on the others. The other material that we like to use for bindings is mesh. You can see on this little project that we made with Tula's True Colors, this is our pattern meshing around. We've bound the mesh on top and bottom using fold over elastic, but on this project, we bound the mesh on top and bottom using fabric. So you can do it either way. And let's talk first about doing it with fabric, then we'll talk about doing it with mesh. So when we're ready to do the binding with fabric, again, we're going to take our piece of binding, fold it in half and pin it. Don't press it. This piece looks like it's been pressed because it's been in my bag folded up for a long time, but don't do that. Then you're going to put your pieces together. There we go. And you're going to sew them together. I prefer to sew with the fabric on bottom and the mesh on top, so I can keep my eye on these edges and make sure they're not pulling away. Some people prefer to sew with the fabric on top. It works either way. So get that sewn with a 1/4 inch seam, and then you want to press your seam away from your mesh, or towards your fabric. Again, because I don't want to put an iron on my binding, I use my pressing tool and I just run it across here. So my seam looks like this. I take it up, I run my pressing tool along here, and I press the seam so that all my raw edges are going up to my binding. Then I can fold this over and bring it so that it's even and stitch along the edge. So when I'm done, it's going to look like this. My goal is that you cannot tell which side I bound from. It looks exactly the same on each side. So you're not seeing the back bindings showing here or on the other side. Because it usually looks the best on the side that I just sewed, as this comes out of my machine, I usually put a little wonder clip on there with the colored side up. That way, when I go put this in my project, I know that's the right size and side, and I don't even have to look at it. So that is binding mesh using fabric. Next, let's talk about binding mesh using fold over elastic. And my piece fell on the floor. So here, I've actually got some tape on here, which I'm going to pull off because I don't usually use basting tape on this. I just did this for demonstration purposes. And I can be able to pull that off without making a mess. Yeah, there we go. So I've got my piece of fold over elastic. And as I said earlier, we can either put it with the matte side showing or the shiny side. You can decide on this one. I think I want the shiny side out. So I'm going to have the matte side out. I've got my pocket. I'm going to align it right along the fold that's woven in that piece of fold over elastic. And then I'm going to fold that over. My hands aren't working way out here. I'm going to fold that over and stitch along the edge. So when I'm done, it's going to look like this. So I'm stitching right along that very edge. And I think this is the back side. I think this is the side I stitched on. You can see that there's a few little inconsistencies here where it's not lined up perfectly. It looks much better on this side. So again, I'd put my wonder clip on with the colored side up. No, that's the right size. So that one's done with the matte side out. That one's done with the shiny side out. Either way works. This one, as I sewed this one in place, so let's put a pin in here and I can show you how this works. So as we start stitching here, I stretched my elastic as I sewed. So I lined my my mesh up along that center fold and just gave this a little stretch. Your machine's going to be holding this in, so it's not going to move on you. And that's how I got this effect. So that gives me that little bit of gather for my pocket. And you can use the fold over elastic to bind the top of a fabric pocket exactly the same way to give you a little bit of gathering, which is what we did on this Bowl Me Over pattern. So we've got the fold over elastic that gathered the pocket to give it some little added stretch there. All right, that's a basic overview of binding fabric, binding mesh, and vinyl. Are you ready to go bind some edges, Sharon?
Absolutely. I love all the tips that you've shared with us. Thank you for all of that. And there's a lot of comments coming through on your stiletto. And I have to say, I will definitely be getting a few stilettos myself. You make this stiletto looks so much easier. And I'm sure that it is, with the perfect tools make the job much easier, as we all know. There are a couple of questions in here too about the fabrics. Some of the fabrics that Annie had on her table earlier were Kismet from Val Wells. That fabric delivers in May. It should be in your local quilt shop now. There's some Tula Pink that Annie had in some bags, homemade, that shipped in March. So that should also be in your local quilt stores. And then she has some wonderful samples of Cave Facet with the oranges and the beautiful flowers on a lot of the bags that she also has on the table. And that fabric, the orange fabric, delivered in February of 2020 of this year. And the one, I think it's called Luscious, it's over on the right. Annie, I believe that one's delivering in August of 2020 this year. But either way, the fabrics are coming if they're not already in stores, and please go see your local retailer if you're looking for those fabrics. Annie also loved those Wonder Clips. Personally, I've never used those until recently, and those are awesome. What I think I love most is not tearing my skin open with a pin.
Amen, amen, amen. When I started doing bags, I used pins all the time, and then I discovered binder clips, and I used those, and I was just completely sold that those were the best things since sliced bread. And then they came out with Wonder Clips, and oh my gosh, I absolutely cannot imagine making a purse or bag without Wonder Clips. And they hold, a ton of layers. I can take 4 layers of quilted fabric, and you can see, that holds all of those together, and they don't pop off. A lot of people don't know that they have a flat side on the bottom, and if you put that against the bed of your machine, it's not going to catch as much, and it makes them easier to take off. But yeah, a stiletto, a rotary cutter, Wonder Clips, essential, absolutely essential tools. Did I lose you? I'm not hearing anything.
Fabric? Probably about that here.
I'm on? Huh. Sharon, I can't hear you, but Trevor thinks that we're still on. So give us a little wave or something if you want me to keep going. I can talk about binding 3-dimensional projects if you're ready for me to do that. Oh, are you back?
Wait, she just ended it.
Oh, she just ended it.
She's probably trying to read it. Turn off her audio and video. Pop them back on again.
Sharon, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but if you can, turn off your audio and video and then turn them back on and see what happens. Well, we got through the most important stuff.
We're still alive, so just keep that in mind.
Watch my language, you're saying?
Yeah.
Technology is really good until it doesn't work, especially when you're old ladies.
There she is.
Hi, Annie.
Hi, you're back.
I'm back, but I don't know that we're live.
Are we live? Yep, Trevor and Jake say we're live.
Oh, okay. Well, good. I'm glad we're live. I don't know what happened. All of a sudden you were frozen on my screen and I could see you on Facebook Live, but I couldn't hear you. So,
And you were frozen on our end, so.
all right. Well,
we're
sorry,
back.
everybody. Technical difficulties, the internet, everybody's using it from home now. So are we being seen just fine? All right. Nancy says we're on. Can you guys see us fine? Can you hear me, Annie?
I can hear you fine. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're back. So sorry,
right.
everybody, about that. So we were talking about Wonder Clips. That's the last that I had heard that you were talking about. And somebody earlier on was asking about your fancy pin cushion over there, Annie.
This one, my little wool pin cushion.
Yes. What is that, like a design roll? Or is that?
Well, it's wool, and it's just, I actually bought old skirts and throw them in the washer with cold water and then in the dryer to felt them.
Right.
And this is included, the instructions for this is in our pattern called needle case and wool pin cushion. But these are fabulous pin cushions because every time you put your needle in wool, it lubricates it. It has that lanolin in it, and it just makes them so nice. So yeah, that's a fabulous pattern.
Yeah, I love that. I when it was sitting there, it almost looked like it was, a design roll, like it, sitting there.
Yeah,
on the
I don't
side.
think you'd want to make it out of fabric. I think you want to make it out of wool because you want that lubrication ability.
Yes, I totally agree. So since we lost a little time there with that frozen screen and I could see and hear you, but I could see you, but I couldn't hear you. I know that we wanted to move on and I wanted to ask you a question about the Ultimate Travel Bag.
Okay.
Is it a lot harder to do? What kind of tips and tricks do you have in making the Ultimate Travel Bag?
Okay, I've got some good tips for that. I'm going to grab one. I've got one right here. So one thing that I can tell you is that making this bag is no harder than making another bag. In fact, in many ways, it's easier because it's bigger and you're not working in as tight a quarters. It's binding just like I showed you, except that I have two tips that I'm going to share with you next. One of them is how to deal with a dimensional project and also how to deal with bulk. So one tip that I will share, this is again a free pattern called Easy Does It that's on our website. It's a dimensional bag. It has a zipper side strip just like Ultimate Travel. And this little seam right here is done differently than our regular bindings. And it's a really good one to learn. So if you haven't already downloaded this pattern and tried this, please do. The video that goes with this one is really excellent. So there's several things. I'm going to start with how to do this, and then we'll talk about doing a dimensional bag. So when you make that bag, you're going to put your zipper in between two strips of fabric, and then you're going to join those to another one that doesn't have, any zipper in it. And you're going to sew those together, and you want to bind the edges. Now, normally when we do a binding, we're going to do it just like we normally did. We're going to sew across that with a 1/4" seam, and then normally what we would do is fold that over and stitch along the edge. If you do that on this, you get a really pretty finished binding, but what happens when you open that strip, can you see that big lump that's right there? It gives you a big lump in your strip, and invariably what I see happen is people are sewing their bag together and they're concentrating on keeping their edges and their nice 1/4" seam. And when they get to this, they just fold it over whatever they're stitching and they stitch it down. So what happens is on this side, they stitch it this way. On this one, they're coming from this direction and they stitch it that way. And then they not only have that big lump, but it has a twist in it. So there's a much better way to do this that eliminates bulk, and that's what I'm going to show you next. So here we've got the same thing, a little bit wider strip, but the same concept. So I've sewn my binding on, and this is really important. When you do this, make sure you're sewing, you've got your right sides together, but make sure you're sewing on the side where the zipper is. And you'll see why in a minute. But I'm going to sew that together with a 1/4" seam, and then I'm going to do 2 extra lines of stitching. When we talked earlier, we said, way back when we talked about soft and stable, we said the more you sew through the soft and stable, the more it compresses. So doing extra lines of stitching in there really helps to compress the layers. So I sewed that with a 1/4 inch seam, and then I did lines 1/8 of an inch on either side of it. So I did 1/8 inch, a 1/4 inch, and 3/8 of an inch. If you look at that compared to that, I don't know if you can see that, but you can see that the one where I've done the extra lines of stitching is much more compressed. Okay, now when I go to fold this over, you're going to see right away that I've got to do something different because there isn't enough fabric to come over since I did that wider stitch. So now what we're going to do is open this strip. I'm going to lay it down on the table so you can see it. We're going to open that so that this is flat. We're going to fold this over, and we're going to lay this down flat against our side strip. This is why we want it to sew first to this side, because when we stitch this down, we're going to be stitching through here. And if we had started on this side and are folding it here, we'd be sewing through the zipper, which would shorten the length of our zipper and it wouldn't look very nice. So just make sure that you're doing it over here. And what I have found really helps on this is if I stitch along here and sew that down first, just makes it lay a little bit nicer. And then I can come along here and stitch 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and then I finish stitching there. So when I'm done, it's going to look like that. So you can see how nice and flat that is. And if I hold that up, you can see I now have a really flat strip going across there. So that's going to help when I go to attach this to the front or back of my bag. It's going to be much easier to sew through that because I don't have all that bulk. The other thing to know when you're sewing on a dimensional bag is that whichever piece, so let's look at this little open wide that we made with Tula's True Colors, or actually this might be from line work, I'm not sure. This one, we rounded the corners down here on this end, and then our body, which was one straight piece, had to conform to those. So whatever piece has the corners rounded on it, when you go to sew it together and to attach your binding, that's the piece that you want to put flat against the bed of the machine when you first start sewing. So you're going to sew your binding on while that's flat, and then you're going to turn it around and stitch it down from this side. If you try doing it this way, you just can't control all that excess fabric that's having to go around those curves underneath, and you're going to have wrinkles in there. So that's one tip for sewing around the edges. And then here's my last tip. And this is something that I actually learned way back when I was in high school home ec, is using a hammer. So this is our sewing machine cover. And when we get right here on the base of this, we are sewing through, double layers of fabric, and we've got pockets here. So we've got 8 layers of fabric, 4 layers of soft and stable, and then the double layers of our binding. Well, way more than that. We've got all of that folded over here, and then we have to bind this edge. So I lost track. I don't even know how many layers of soft and stable and binding we're sewing through there. And that is where people sometimes are going to run into problems breaking their needle, because they're going to push or pull on that or go too fast. So here's the secret on this. Get yourself a little hammer, and don't do this on your sewing machine table or your good furniture. I have an old breadboard, and I put that underneath there. And then I hope I don't bang your ears out, but I just take my little hammer that I bought, and I take that on there and hammer it. And you probably can't see that on there, but it's amazing how much you can compress that. So if you hammer that really good before you start that last binding on there, it's just going to make that really compress and be so much easier to do. So another essential tool in the quilter's toolkit is a hammer, or the bag maker's toolkit.
I love that. I love that, Annie. That's a great tip. So between the stiletto, the hammer, the breadboard, love the tip on, bringing it around the curve the way you showed on the smaller bag. Great tip. Love that. Were you going to keep going? I didn't mean to interrupt you. I mean, I
No,
just had
actually,
to after that hammer.
that was kind of that. Just, you know, using a stiletto makes a difference. The hammer makes a difference. And, you know, there's really no real tricks to it. Just know that a beautifully bound edge is going to take your project from looking homemade to designer quality. It's going to give you that Cadillac finish. And the main thing I can tell you is just, you know, not experiment. What's the word I'm looking for? Do it.
Practice,
You know,
practice.
Practice. You didn't learn to drive in a day. You're not going to make beautiful bindings the first time you attempt it, most likely. But if you start with something little like Peacekeeper and do it on something flat, and then move up to something dimensional, and then move up to something that has a whole lot of layers like that, you're going to be successful. So I hope you have enjoyed learning all those tips and techniques. I've really had fun sharing them with you. Don't forget that our Peacekeeper, our Call Me, our Easy Does It patterns all have really good tips for attaching bindings and joining the ends with diagonal seams. If you have any questions about any of the models we've shown today, there is that list on our blog that shows all the different models, and it includes information about the fabrics we use, the designer, what color of zippers and mesh we use. So all kinds of great information in there. And check with your local quilt shop to get the patterns and supplies. If they don't have them, remind them that they can order them directly from us or from their favorite distributor. You know, let's all do our part to keep those quilt shops strong and successful. And thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us today and over the past 5 weeks. It has just been so much fun to spend all this time with all of you. I hope you'll keep in touch with us. Be sure to visit us on our social media. You can find us at Patterns by Annie and also at byannie.com. And to say thank you for joining us, we've got some fun giveaways to give today. So what we decided to do today, Sharon, do you have fabrics ready to go?
I do. So.
All right, so our first one that we're going to do today is the pattern for running with scissors and a stiletto, that essential tool. And I think Sharon has some fun fabrics to go with that.
I do, and that's a perfect, more perfect fabric than running with scissors than tools from Tula Pink. So this is a homemade collection, and these are the fabrics that are going to go with that pattern. And the question for this week, I have to, hold on everybody, had a question for this week. We would like to know, what is your next project that you're going to make with By Annie? Which By Annie pattern are you going to make, and which Free Spirit fabric are you going to use to make it? So Annie has that one, running with scissors. And then the next one is which one, Annie?
The next one, I'm trying to get the model. I forgot to show you running with scissors. Well, we showed it earlier. Let me just grab that in case someone needs to know. So running with scissors is this bag that's perfect for carrying all your tools in. And so that's perfect, made with Tula's homemade fabric. The next one we're doing is the Glow and Go pattern, and this also includes a stiletto. And Glow and Go makes this fun little bag, and also the wrap that has the mesh pockets inside, so you can carry your makeup and toiletries and things in it.
Okay, and the fabrics that we're doing with this is Sue Penn. This is called Light in the Forest by Sue Penn. And this fabric is shipping in July. So you go to your local quilt shop and ask them for Sue Penn's next collection coming up. It's called Light in the Forest, and that will go beautifully with that bag that Annie is giving away with that wonderful stiletto. And the last gift for this week.
The last one is In Control, and that makes this awesome little bag, which is the little sister to my catch-all caddy. You can see all the tools and supplies I have in here. Believe it or not, almost all of this also fits in here, and I usually keep one of these right next to my sewing machine. It has a smaller footprint, so it doesn't take up as much room, but it's so nice to have everything handy when you need it. So this one, again, the pattern and the stiletto. What fabric are you making that one out of?
Okay, so the fabric for this, I love this fabric. This is a new designer with Free Spirit. This is Martha Negley, and this collection is called Veggies. And that bag, you know, if you're a gardener, maybe you want to keep your seeds and tools in that bag. Get these beautiful radishes, these gorgeous tomatoes, and some parsley. And you could put together a really fun bag with these fabrics. The more I look at these fabrics, I love them more and more every week. So if you are interested in, of course, winning, who doesn't want to win these great fabrics and patterns and tools that Annie has supplied us with? The question is, which By Annie bag are you going to make next, and which Free Spirit collection or designer are you going to use to make your bag? So please put all your comments on our make your comments on our page, and we will review them. Because we won't be seeing Annie next week, we will announce the winners. So please look on our Facebook page for the winners. We will probably be announcing them maybe early next week, probably on Tuesday. They'll be up by that date. So please look for it. And if you are, when you are announced as a winner, you need to get in touch with us and give us your mailing address. And that's the same for today's winners earlier in the day. So Annie, couple of things. As you've already said, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a very quick 5 weeks. It's been wonderful working with you and your staff. You've all been so fantastic. I've learned a lot. I still have a lot to learn, not only about bags, but about going to doing a Facebook Live. But I'll get there. The next time we have you on, it will just be perfect. We'll be
old pros by then.
That's right. That's right. There'll be no glitches along the way. So thank you so much for everyone's patience. And the whole program has been fantastic. Free Spirit has loved having you on as a guest, and we know that our viewers have loved having you, and we would love to have you again. I'd like to go as far as to suggest that, you know, if your schedule allows, maybe this fall we could, you know, collaborate together. It would be fantastic if we could have you back. I know the viewers would love it. So in terms of this week's segment, talking about the bindings, Annie and I are going to kind of sort of end right now, but not really end, because there were people, we didn't have time last week to talk about the magnets. So we're going to pretend that we're ending now, and that way Lindsay can try to post this. So what happens is we try to stay under an hour so that the posts can go up. They're a little easier to post on other social media platforms. And so Lindsay can kind of just cut us off anywhere here that she wants and post us. And we're just going to go into a quick segment here for those of you that have stayed tuned. And Annie is going to tell us how to put magnets in our bags when we make our bags, because last week we ran out of a little bit of time. So here's a little bonus for all of you that have stayed, and send us some thumbs up and some hearts if you're all excited about this, because I know that I am. I'm looking forward to this. All of your tips and tricks have been fantastic, Annie, so thank you so much. So I'll turn it over to you now. So you just tell us everything we need to know for magnets.
Okay, yeah, magnets are really easy, but there are some tips to know to get good results. So what I'm going to show you is how to do a magnet for this Bowl Me Over bag. So there's a pocket on the front, and there's a little flap that closes with a magnet here. So that makes it easy to get into the pocket, but also ensures that everything inside will be safe and secure. And again, attaching the magnet is easy, but there's some really important tips to ensure success. First of all, we use sew-in magnets. So these have a little vinyl sleeve that goes around the magnet. We can sew it in, and that way we're not having to put any holes in our bag. Second, in order to make sure that you don't see those lines that attach the magnet on the outside of the flap, we attach the magnet to a facing that's attached to the inside, and we make sure that we use some interfacing on that, because that also prolongs the life. We do the same thing for the magnet that is attached to the bag. On here, you can see we used a totally different fabric for that little facing that covers it. We found that these magnets are so incredibly strong that if we just put the two magnets together, it doesn't take any time at all before they're tearing out of this little vinyl sleeve. So having the fabric over it really prolongs their life. So let's start by looking at the magnets so that you understand how they're designed. Our magnets come in sets, and there is a positive side, which has a little plus on in the corner of the vinyl sleeve. and there's a negative, which has a minus. And you know, you learned in science in grade school that you have to have magnets with positive and negative. So that's the first thing to notice. You'll also notice that each of these has a dot on it. That dot that's stamped into the metal means that that is the wrong side of the magnet. If you look at the other side, you're going to see that they're smooth and flat. So if you want your magnet to be really strong, you want to put it together with the smooth sides together. I can already feel the attraction right there. They're wanting to go together. If you put them together, wrong sides together, or the two dots together, it's not going to do much of anything. It's not strong. You have to put, oops, well, there I go. So you've got to put those right sides together, and you can see that's difficult. One thing to know when you buy our magnets, they're shipped like this. We have to put them with the right sides together. Otherwise, all the packages stick together. So when you go to take these apart, if you just kind of slide them like that, they're going to move better. Also make sure that on this bag, it's going to be easy because we only have one magnet. But if you're doing, say you had two magnets on here, make sure that you put both of the positives on one side and both of the negatives on the other side, so you don't accidentally have two positives or two negatives coming together, because then they're going to repel each other. So again, wrong sides, you don't have nearly the same attraction, and two positives, they're going to repel. Also, it's really important that these magnets line up properly when the flap is closed. So I want to make sure that this magnet is hitting right here, not, I don't want this one sewn way up here, and so when the flap comes down, it misses it entirely. So any by-any pattern that uses magnets is going to give you instructions for marking lines so that they're attached in the right place. We also want to make sure that it's high enough up that when we sew the binding on, we're not running into it. So follow the pattern instructions really carefully to ensure that your magnets are attached properly, and always make sure that you test them before you do it. So here's an example of how we did it on the flap. So we marked a line going across here, we marked two lines here, and then we centered the positive side of the magnet with the right side down, because this one's right side up, this one's right side down, so that my right sides are aligning here. So this is my flap, this is going to be attached here. That puts my right side down, but I need my wrong side up here. So the pattern will say, put the positive side down with the dot up, or the wrong side up. So then I'm going to sew on that, and I just sew around this about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and I usually go around it twice. I will usually take a little swish of glue from a washable school glue stick and put it on the magnet before I sit it down so it stays there. The next thing you're going to notice is that, and this happens a lot, this magnet wants to stick to your foot plates on your machine. If you take a little piece of cardstock or an old credit card or old room key and put it underneath there, it will kind of break that and make it much easier to stitch around it. So go around that twice. Try to pick a thread here, because this is going to show on the underside that blends. Obviously, I mean, what thread could you have picked for that to blend any better? There's too many colors on there. But you know, try and make that so that it's not too noticeable. Then you'll take your flap, you'll put it on, you know, your piece that has your magnet on there. You'll round the corners and bind it. Make sure that you're rounding the bottom corners where the magnet's closest to it. Don't accidentally turn it this way and bind them, because then again, your magnet's going to end up way up here rather than down here. So the really important thing is make sure you're reading what the pattern says, because it will tell you all of that. So that gets our magnet attached to the flap. Then we're going to take the other piece, the other side of our magnet, and attach it to the pocket. And on this one, we want to have our smooth side up, or rounded, or our right side up, so that when we bring our two magnets together, they're good and strong. And sew around that. Then we're going to make a little facing here. We're going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam, fold that up, and that's going to cover it, so that then when we put our magnets together, they're good and sturdy. And that's basically it. You pay attention to positive, negative, right side, wrong side. Those are the most important things. Put them together in sets, attach them so that the bond is the strongest. Follow the pattern really carefully and you'll get great results.
Oh, thank you so much, Annie. I call that pay attention sewing,
Yes.
when I'm sewing and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I got this, and I'm sewing along and then I'm like, oh, it doesn't work. Now I got to rip it out.
Yeah.
So that's pay attention sewing, but those are great tips on, how to place the magnets in a way. And I love the tip about, because that would have definitely happened to me. The magnet would have got stuck on the plate as I was trying to get it through, and then I'd probably be breaking a needle. So
Yep.
wonderful
Yeah,
tips
there's
there.
nothing hard about it, but you're right. Pay attention sewing is definitely the case on that one. That is one, and test it before you finalize it, because it's way easier to, unpick it here than it is to have to take that whole flap apart or your whole bag apart. And, we've done that occasionally, but not when we're paying attention. So.
Right. So pay attention sewing when you're doing the magnets. So, all right, Annie, well, thank you so much. I have a few other things I'd like to announce. Again, thank you so much for doing this little bonus at the end of our final week, because I know that many viewers last week were disappointed that we didn't have the opportunity to do the magnets. So we appreciate that. And I know our viewers this week, I'm sure, are just as happy about that, because everyone's still saying great tips and all kinds of really positive comments. So people are really happy that we had the opportunity to do this part of it. So thank you. I'd like to remind everybody that freespiritfabrics.com, you can go to our website, you can view our fabrics, but you need to go to a quilt store in order to buy our fabrics. So if you've seen anything here that Annie has shown in any of the bags that she's displayed over the past 5 weeks, you could go to the quilt shop. They potentially have her patterns there along with Free Spirit Fabrics. And if they don't have either, you should ask them to bring in by Annie patterns and bring in Free Spirit Fabrics, because you'd like to see them in the quilt store. So, please reach out to your local quilt store. As Annie mentioned earlier, it's been a tough year, and we really want to try and support everybody in the quilting world, and let's do our best to help keep those shops open. They're the ones that offer us the most unique products, that we're not going to find just anywhere. And that's what keeps our sewing more personal to ourselves. So I'd like to say that I neglected to mention in the very beginning, this beautiful quilt behind me. This is called Shot Stripe Frames. This is, it's hanging sideways because I get more coverage that way. But this is K Facet. This is his shot cotton and his shot cotton stripes. This is a pattern that you can find on the Free Spirit website. So if you are interested again in any of those fabrics, go to your local quilt store. They currently have them in stock and you can get those fabrics. I love that quilt. It's a great quilt. Next week, we will not be with By Annie, but we will in the fall, Annie. Okay. hopefully. I
can't wait to hear who you've got next week, who
yes.
I'll get to watch.
Right. So next week, we've got Jemima Flint from Tied with a Ribbon, and she will be airing from Australia. That's how I, figured out that time frame so perfectly this week. So next week, we'll actually be airing at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, because it will be 7 a.m. for Jemima. So she will be up very early. And, so I'm sure that there'll be a lot of people in Australia that would love to see her as well, and people all over the country and the world that would be interested in seeing what Jemima is going to show us. She's going to be doing a trunk show showing her patterns in Free Spirit Fabrics. So please tune in next week. Again, we'll put a post on our Facebook page to remind everybody what time, but it is a little later because of the time frame. We don't want Jemima to have to get up at 3 a.m. in the morning to come see us. I think
That's
she
really
would,
sweet
but
of you.
right.
I think she appreciated that.
Right, exactly. I'm sure she would, because she's such a sweetheart, but that would just be mean. So we don't want to do that. So again, Annie, thank you so much. We've really enjoyed this time with you. If anybody has any questions, just post it on our Facebook page. Viewers, thank you for tuning in every week. Your excitement is very contagious. We've all been very, very excited with all of this over the past 5 weeks. It's been really, really fun. Annie's had so much to to share with us so much knowledge, so many fantastic tips. And we love that it's all been in Free Spirit fabrics so the viewers could see how beautifully those fabrics work into not just quilts, but bags, and in so many different ways the fabrics can be used. So thank you to everybody, and please come see us next week. And Annie, thank you again. I don't know if you want to say another final goodbye.
Thank you again. This, as I said earlier, has been just really a whole lot of fun. And I can't tell you how much we enjoy working with Free Spirit Fabrics. They're just gorgeous, and they make everything that we make look so good. And you're all so wonderful to work with. So thank you so much, and I'll hope to see you maybe in the fall.
Yes, hopefully, if we have a quilt market, maybe we'll see each other in person. So thank you, viewers. Tune in next week, 7:00 p.m. Tied with the Ribbon, Jemima Flint. And thank you so much, Annie, again, to you and your team. We've loved it, and we'll see you again soon. Everybody have
Bye-bye.
a great week and keep on sewing.